stay hydrated after the last couple days. So in thinking about what I wanted to talk about this morning, about our Parashat Shoftim, there's a couple things that sort of stand out for someone who cares about social justice like I do. This is one of the hallmark Parshiot. We get the famous line, Tzedek, Tzedek Tir Dof, that the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg found so powerful, meaning justice, justice you shall pursue, that she actually had it framed on the wall in her chambers in the Supreme Court. Lots been said about Tzedek, Tzedek Tir Dof. I'm going to talk about it another time. A second thing I thought to talk about is in our Parsha we get this sort of strange mitzvah where when the Israelites are setting forth to conquer the land of Canaan, if they lay siege to an area and there happens to be a fruit tree in their midst, they're not allowed to cut down the fruit tree. And this actually becomes the basis for the entirety of the Jewish environmental movement, which again will be a conversation for another day. But instead, when I was reading through the Parsha this week, there was one little section, one mitzvah that stood out to me as just really strange. And so I wanted to share it with you and try to unpack it a little bit and see if we can get to some understanding of, or at least an understanding of what it's about. So towards the middle of the Parsha in chapter 17, and you're welcome to follow along if you want on page 1093, we're learning about some rules about if the Israelites want to establish a king for themselves. And so we are told that when the king is seated on his royal throne, he shall write a copy of this teaching, meaning the Mishnah Torah, meaning the Torah, for himself on a scroll from the one that is in the charge of the Levitical priests. Let it remain with him and let him read it in all the days of his life. So in other words, the king is supposed to write himself his own Torah scroll and keep it with him, or at least keep a truncated version of that with him at all times. So why? Why is this the mitzvah? Why is this the thing that the Torah chooses to teach us is the most important aspect of what it means to be a king? To answer that, first we have to understand a little bit more about what the biblical mindset was of kingship and what being a king meant from a biblical framing. And to do that, first we have to see what a king did not mean. So there's a few things that the Torah points out that the king does not have power over. First, the king is not above the law. The king has to follow the law. The king has to follow the Torah. This was a radical concept at its time. If you think of the Egyptian pharaohs, they were actually considered to be not just agents of gods, but gods themselves. And in Mesopotamian society, kings would be established that may not be actual gods, but were very much in absolute control, absolute power, appointed by the gods for all time with complete authority to do what they wanted. So this notion of being a king under the law was a very revolutionary concept. The king was not allowed to see himself as higher than the Israelites. He was bound just as they were by the law and by the Torah, and if he deviated from the Torah, he and his kin would be cut off, as we actually learn in the case of King Saul later on. The second constraint on monarchical power is that the Torah requires a separation of powers. Again, another sort of revolutionary idea if we think about it as something that's natural to us as Americans who grew up learning about separation of powers. This is not something that existed back then. The king is not in charge of the judiciary. The judiciary is completely independent. And the king, also importantly, is not in charge of ritual, of sacrificial worship, of the priesthood. The Kohanim and the Leviim, the priests are completely independent of the king. The third constraint on the king is that the king is not supposed to either acquire a lot of horses, which limited the king's ability to conduct war because he needed horses for chariots, nor was the king to acquire too many wives, which was primarily about creating political alliances through having a harem of different wives that were connected to different political alliances, nor was the king supposed to acquire a lot of wealth. It's basically kind of the antithesis of what King Solomon does, but we'll put that off. So the king is constrained in terms of what he can do for warfare, for wealth, for wives, for political alliances, separation of powers, and being under the law. The only thing that we actually learn the king is supposed to do, the only positive commandment about the king, is what I just started off with earlier about the king's requirement to write himself a Torah scroll and keep it with him at all times. In this way, what the king actually is all about here is that the king is supposed to embody what the ideal Israelite citizen is supposed to be. The king is supposed to study Torah daily, just like the Israelites are supposed to study Torah daily. The king is supposed to love God, just like the Israelites are supposed to love God. and a king is supposed to be bound by the mitzvot, just like the Israelites are supposed to be bound by the mitzvot. So what we have here is this commandment to write a Torah scroll for himself is, in many ways, just sort of an amplification, a magnification of the command that we're also going to receive a couple chapters down the road for each of us to write a Torah scroll. It comes in towards the end of Deuteronomy in chapter 31. So why the significance about writing a Torah scroll? What's the big deal about writing a scroll that's so important that it's the one command given to kings, and it's also a command that's given a second time to us? The reason behind the mitzvah of writing a Torah is the personal connection that we can have from taking the time, the slow, granular effort of writing letter by letter, word by word, enables a different kind of connection to the text. A development of a deeper personal connection that we can get from the text from actually knowing it. If you've ever taken the time to write something by hand, you internalize it in a way that's, scientists have shown you can actually learn much more about the material you're trying to learn if you write notes by hand as opposed to typing them up. There's something that's sort of internalizing power of writing that I think this is getting at. In fact, the rabbis in the Talmud, they say that this notion of full immersion is so intense that writing a Torah is akin to having been able to stand at Mount Sinai when God gave the Ten Commandments. Writing a Torah is just like receiving the Torah directly from God. A mystical commentary called the Zohar Chadash notes that there are 300,000 letters in the Torah, and when we take the time to write a Torah for ourselves, that 300,000 plus additional 300,000 that we do creates 600,000, which actually is the number of Israelites that are said to have been standing at Mount Sinai when the Ten Commandments were received. To put another way, adding our personal contribution is what completes the Torah and enables each of us to find the elements of the Torah that speak most to us. The mitzvah of writing one's own Torah is an opportunity for us to pay attention to the text in a more careful and more personal way, to extract what is most relevant and meaningful to us. The Torah we write for ourselves, whether it's the actual Torah or a metaphorical Torah, the personal Torah that we create from that engagement, from that immersion, is a Torah that we can carry within each of us, a Torah that's also unique to our needs and our circumstances. One of my favorite memories from when we belonged to Bethel many moons ago was when Bethel commissioned the writing of a Sefer Torah. It's one of these, I'm not sure exactly which one. I'm sure Rich or John, you can tell us later. So for those who are newer, there's a commissioning of a Torah, and members of the community had the opportunity to come in and actually write a letter that was going into the Torah, to work alongside the scribe, the sofer, and write a letter. My wife Elena, my son Dimitri, and I participated in this opportunity. It was really a sacred, special moment to actually sit there and write a letter of Torah. And even though it wasn't writing an entire Torah, it was a powerful experience nonetheless. Now, I hope you don't mind me getting personal for a minute. On Monday, my son is heading off to Tulane for his freshman year of college. It is my hope and prayer that he will carry his own metaphorical Torah with him as he ventures forward, guided by the wisdom of our tradition, a Torah unique to his needs and that he shapes through his own experiences. I know that there are several others in our community who are also graduates of high school, Sydney, who will be going off in the next days and weeks on their own. So I hope to extend this blessing of internalizing and taking with you your own Torah wherever all of our high school graduates are venturing off to. And may we each, high school graduates or not, be blessed to internalize our own sense of Torah and to carry that text, that tradition, that grounding with us wherever we go on this Shabbat and always. Shabbat Shalom.